My name is Rowan Ellis, and I didn't want to be there. I don't mean that in the usual, everyday sense of dragging your feet to some social obligation. I mean it in the marrow deep way that your gut clenches before something goes wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't announce itself with a bang, but with a whisper and a smile. Maribel, my wife, for what that still meant back then, stood in the driveway with a red thermos and a checklist in her hand, barking out last-minute instructions like a field commander. Micah, grab your jacket. Zane says it gets cold up there after sundown. Micah, our 10-year-old son, scampered by with a flashlight nearly half his size. His eyes were bright, cheeks flushed with excitement. To him, this was an adventure. To me, it was a trap we both hadn't seen clearly yet. I loaded the last cooler into the back of Zane's SUV, the one with the cracked taillight he never bothered fixing, and shut the hatch with more force than necessary. I didn't trust them. I hadn't for a while. Maribel and I were barely talking unless it was about bills or Micah's school. Her layoff only made things worse. She didn't blame the company, she blamed me. Said I had my head buried in Hollow Point Systems, my startup, too deep to notice she was sinking. So, in what I assumed was an attempt at mending or masking things, she suggested this trip. To reconnect, she said, putting a hand on my arm like she remembered how. We all need this. We included her old college friends Sierra and Brooke, plus Zane, her half-brother, who never quite grew out of the frat boy phase. I wanted to say no. I almost did. But then Micah overheard, and his face lit up in that way kids do when they still believe the world is good and fair and full of magic. We're going camping? All of us. What could I say to that? I said yes. The drive was long, winding, and full of empty conversation. Zane led the way in his car, and we followed in ours, stocked with enough supplies for a long weekend in the wild. Micah kept asking if we'd see bears. I told him hopefully not. Maribel stared out the passenger side window like the trees had answers she couldn't find in me anymore. We arrived late afternoon, the kind of golden hour that makes even broken things look whole. Olympic National Park sprawled in every direction with thick green, a world where reception died and silence grew. The cars were parked on a gravel clearing, ringed by towering pines. A shallow river hummed nearby, soft and forgettable. Sierra was already there, setting up her tent with military precision. Brooke, in sunglasses too expensive for the woods, was scrolling through her phone even though we all knew the signal had already dropped. Zane cracked open a beer, passed another to Maribel, and gave me a wink that didn't feel friendly. "Welcome to paradise, man," he said, raising his can. I forced a smile. I hadn't wanted to be there, and now I was standing in it, surrounded by forced laughter and inside jokes I was never part of. Micah ran to help Sierra with her tent. She smiled at him like she hadn't spent the last 3 Christmases avoiding our family. That first night, we sat around a fire Zane built with what he claimed he chopped himself, even though I saw the plastic-wrapped logs in the back of his truck. Maribel sat close to him, too close. Brooke played some terrible pop song from a Bluetooth speaker. I watched the flames dance while the beer in my hand went warm. Micah leaned against my side, yawning. "Dad, this is the best," he murmured. I kissed his forehead and told him I was glad he was having fun. He deserved this. I didn't. Later that night, after Micah fell asleep in our tent, I stood outside under a sky too clear to lie beneath. I looked at the shapes moving near the fire, Zane whispering something into Maribel's ear, her laughing and swatting his arm. Sierra watching. Brooke slipping off into the trees to take a phone call that wouldn't go through. It was all wrong. Like a play I hadn't been cast in but somehow had to sit through. I went to bed with a headache and a knot in my chest. The next morning, over instant coffee and oatmeal packets, Maribel said we should all do our own thing for a bit. "Take Micah on one of your little walks," she said, using the tone she reserved for hobbies she didn't respect. "There's a short trail by the stream. Won't take more than an hour." I didn't argue. What was the point? Micah was already lacing up his boots. I grabbed my small pack, tucked in a map and a canteen, and we headed out. The trees swallowed us quickly, and for a while, I forgot the tension, forgot the dull throb in my skull. Micah quizzed me about animal tracks and asked if he could build a fort when we got back. I told him we'd see. 45 minutes later, we returned to the clearing, and everything was gone. The tents, the cars, the gear, the people, all of it, except for a single note sitting in the middle of the picnic table, held down by a stone. I didn't pick it up right away. I just stood there, my mouth dry. Micah looked around, confused. Where'd everybody go? I finally stepped forward. The handwriting was familiar. Zane's. Sloppy. Smug. This is for the best. Trust me. My legs went numb. My ears filled with static. Micah tugged at my sleeve. Dad? Where's Mom? I looked down at him and smiled because that's what I was supposed to do. That's what he needed me to do. Maybe they went looking for us, I said. He nodded, trusting me, believing me. Still a boy. But I knew. I knew in that moment what I couldn't say out loud. They left us. On purpose. Micah was still chewing on the last of the granola bar when we returned. His little hiking boots stomped against the trail like he was some explorer discovering new land. He kept laughing about a squirrel we'd seen that darted across our path. The sun had shifted slightly, the shadows stretching longer over the clearing. But when we stepped back into the camp, the sound of his laughter died. So did every sound in my head. The tents were gone. Not flattened. Not zipped up and stored. Gone. The cars? Gone. The food, backpacks, sleeping bags, even the fire pit had been covered with dirt. It was like no one had ever been there. Micah froze beside me. Where's everyone? I couldn't answer. My feet refused to move at first. My eyes searched the space like maybe this was some sort of elaborate prank. Like they were hiding behind trees, holding in laughter. But the air didn't hold any joy. Just silence. Just the faint, sharp sting of pine and something else, something wrong. Then I saw it. A piece of paper on the picnic table, fluttering slightly in the breeze, held down by a fist-sized stone. I already knew who wrote it before I got close. I didn't even need to read the words yet. I recognized Zane's stupid looped letters from a mile away. Micah followed close behind, his hand in mine. I picked up the paper. This is for the best. Trust me. No date. No explanation. No apology. Just betrayal written in black ink. My heart stopped for a second. Not skipped. Stopped. And in the quiet that followed, the noise started, the roar of thoughts, of confusion, of rage trying to claw its way out of my chest. Micah looked up at me with wide eyes. Where's Mom? I felt the panic crawl up my spine, but I forced it back. I had to. For him. I couldn't let him see me fall apart. I crouched down so we were eye to eye. Maybe they went looking for us, I said, the lie already tasting like poison in my mouth. He nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Kids don't need evidence to sense something is wrong. They just know. I scanned the perimeter. Nothing left behind. No spare food, no water, no extra clothes. Even the first aid kit we kept near the tents gone. They had taken everything. Methodically, deliberately. I walked to where our tent had been, dropped to my knees, and started clawing at the dirt. Nothing. They hadn't just left. They had erased us. Like we never existed here. Like this was always meant to be a one-way trip. I took a deep breath, one that tasted like betrayal and bark, and stood. We'll stay here for a little while, I told Micah. In case they come back. He nodded and sat on the ground, pulling his knees to his chest. I knew they weren't coming back. I knew at the moment I read the note. Hours passed. The sun dropped lower, shadows creeping like quiet hands through the trees. I walked the perimeter twice, hoping maybe they had left something. A clue, a bag, a bottle of water. Nothing. Micah got hungry. I gave him the other granola bar. I told him I wasn't hungry. He didn't believe me, but he didn't argue. He just handed me the last bite before finishing the rest. As night fell, the cold came in sharp. I took the thin emergency blanket from my hiking pack and wrapped him in it. We curled under the wooden shelter near the table, where the roof sagged just enough to block the dew. I held him close, rubbing his back while he drifted to sleep. My eyes stared into the dark. What kind of people leave a child behind? It wasn't just Maribel. It was all of them. Zane, Sierra, Brooke. People we'd laughed with, trusted, made memories with. How long had they planned this? Did they talk about it over wine? Whisper about it in group chats I didn't know existed. And why? That question gnawed at me. Was it me? The tension in our marriage? The way I buried myself in work? Did they think I deserved this? That Micah did? I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a branch made my fist clench. Every whisper of wind made me reach for the Swiss Army knife in my back pocket. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I couldn't afford it. At dawn, I got up, walked to the river, and splashed freezing water over my face. I stared at the reflection in the water, my eyes sunken, my jaw tight. Micah stirred when I returned. Are they back yet? Not yet, I said. I knelt and helped him to his feet. We had to move. We couldn't stay there, hoping. I knew hope was a trap. What we needed was distance, options, and a plan. I gathered what little we had, the knife, the map, the empty canteen, a small flashlight, and packed it into my hiking bag. I tore the note in half, then into quarters, and buried it under the dirt. Micah looked up at me, worried. "Where are we going?" I tightened the straps of the bag. "We're going to find help," I said, my voice steady. "And we're going to be okay." I wasn't sure if I believed it yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever Maribel and the others thought they were doing, they underestimated one truth. You don't abandon a man like me and expect him to disappear. They left us to vanish. I was about to show them just how wrong they were. I told Micah we were going to explore. That was the word I used, explore. Not escape. Not survive. Not flee the crime scene our lives had become. Just explore. Something a kid could understand. Something he could carry without it cracking his little heart. We had 2 granola bars, now 1, a bottle of water barely half full, and the Swiss Army knife I always carried clipped to my belt loop. That was it. No compass. No backup. No signal. Just forest. Towering, endless forest, with the early morning sun filtering through the canopy like stained glass. Micah didn't ask questions. He trusted me. His face was pale, his backpack half empty, and still he looked at me with the kind of belief that made my chest tighten. I couldn't fail him. Not after being left behind like forgotten luggage. We followed the stream, same one from the short trail hike. I figured water would always lead somewhere, a ranger post, a road, a town. I kept him close, within arm's reach. Every crack of a branch made my hand instinctively move to the knife. We walked for hours. The trail disappeared fast. Deer tracks faded. Trees crowded tighter together. I cut through brambles with the knife, parting thick vines as we climbed up an incline slick with moss. I kept my voice light for Micah. "This is just like that survival show you love, huh?" He nodded, then whispered, "But the guy on the show has a camera crew." I laughed. "A real one. First in days." "Well, you've got me. I'm your crew." By midday, the bottle was empty. I didn't want to push him too hard, so we stopped by a pool where the stream widened. I made him rest while I filtered water through a cloth, let it settle, and prayed it was clean enough. He sipped slowly. "We should catch fish," he said, hopeful. Like in the show. One step at a time, but we kept going. I spotted thimbleberries in a patch of sun. I made sure they weren't bitter nightshade first. Then we picked until our hands were stained red. They tasted like tart sugar. Micah smiled again. That night, we stopped by a break in the woods where a cluster of flat rocks surrounded a patch of dry moss. I gathered bark, dead branches, and soft pine needles. I scraped the knife against a rock for what felt like hours until the spark caught. When the fire finally flickered to life, Micah clapped. I let him believe it was magic. "See? We're gonna be fine," I said. We shared the last granola bar. I gave him the bigger half. He handed me a bite anyway. "Dad, do you think Mom got lost too?" I stared at the fire too long before answering. "I think Mom made a mistake. But right now, we're going to be okay because we have each other." He nodded. He understood more than I wanted him to. He curled up beside me, wrapped in the emergency blanket again. The stars above looked fake, like someone punched pinholes in a black sheet. I stayed awake long after his breathing steadied. Every sound felt like a threat. Every rustle was a bear or worse. But what really gnawed at me wasn't outside the firelight. It was the question of why. Why would she leave? Why would Zane, Sierra, Brooke, people who'd held my son, celebrated birthdays with us, toasted to anniversaries, plot something so precise, so heartless? It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment betrayal. This was planned. Every tent folded, every car started, every trace of us removed. This was orchestrated. And then there was the note. "This is for the best. Trust me. Trust me." The words boiled under my skin. Zane, with his condescending smirk and lazy charm. He was the kind of man who thought the world owed him something for surviving it. He always hated that I did well. That I built Hollow Point from my garage and turned it into something that mattered. Maybe he thought he was doing me a favor by disappearing me. Screw that. The next morning, Micah woke up shivering. I gave him the rest of the berries and a few sips of our filtered water. We moved slowly. His feet were sore, but he didn't complain. I made him a walking stick out of a branch, showed him how to balance on it. "You're a real outdoorsman now," I said. He grinned, proud. We kept near the stream. I figured it had to lead us out eventually. Around noon, we found a patch of wild onions. I dug some out with the knife, rinsed them in the water, and chewed slowly. Sharp. Bitter. But it filled the hollow. Micah spit his out. "Tastes like feet." "That means it's working," I said, laughing. We made camp near a rock wall that night. The wind was louder there, the kind that whistles warnings. I built another fire, smaller this time. I noticed Micah wasn't eating as much. Tired? I asked. He nodded, then lay down early. His eyes closed fast, but I could see the heat rising off his forehead. I pressed my palm to it. Too hot. I dug through the pack and pulled out the small Ziploc of dandelion root I'd gathered earlier, not really expecting to use it. I crushed it, poured water over it, and boiled it in a dinted tin cup. The tea was bitter and dark. I raised his head and helped him sip. You're gonna feel better soon, Micah. I promise. He murmured something in his sleep. A name. Mom. I turned away, blinked back the rage. I stayed up again. Firelight dancing. My hands clenched around the knife. We were going to survive. Not because we were lucky. Not because I had some divine plan. But because I was going to will us through it. Because someone needed to answer for this. Because I needed to walk back into civilization with my son beside me, alive. So they would know exactly who they failed to kill. And what they had unleashed instead. By the third day, I was beginning to understand just how cruel the wild could be. It didn't hate you. It didn't love you. It simply didn't care if you lived or died. And that quiet indifference pressed down on me as I carried Micah through a ravine, his weight lighter than it should have been, his breathing shallow against my neck. He had stopped talking sometime late the night before, his voice barely more than a whisper even when he tried. His skin was burning up. We had been surviving on thimbleberries, wild onions, and stream water boiled over shallow fires. I'd even managed to catch a frog once, roasting it on a stick for protein. But it wasn't enough. Micah was small for his age, and this was taking a toll. I told myself it was just fatigue, just hunger. But when he started mumbling in his sleep, feverish and incoherent, I knew it was more than that. We reached a patch of flat ground, and I laid him down gently in a bed of ferns. His face was flushed, beads of sweat forming along his hairline despite the cool mountain air. He shivered, then curled up like he was trying to disappear into himself. I sat beside him, hands trembling, and rummaged through our pack. Nothing helpful. No medicine. No antiseptic. No gauze. I only had what nature could offer, and that terrified me. I remembered an old survival guide I read years ago. Dandelion root could help reduce fever. I had gathered some days earlier and used it sparingly. I chewed a bit now, swallowing the bitterness, then crushed the rest into a tin cup with stream water and set it over a fire I coaxed from damp bark and dry grass. The smoke curled up slowly, lazily, like it had all the time in the world. Micah stirred and called out, barely audible, "Mom." The word was like a knife. I wanted to rage, to scream her name into the trees, to ask how she could do this, how she could leave her own child behind without a second thought. But I didn't. I couldn't afford that luxury. He needed calm. He needed strength. He needed me. I helped him sip the tea when it cooled, holding the cup steady as his hands trembled. He coughed once, then closed his eyes again. His breathing slowed, and for a moment I thought he was slipping further away. I grabbed his hand. It was too hot. "You're okay, Micah," I whispered, trying to make myself believe it. "You're strong, just like your mom used to say." I hated that I said it, but he needed something familiar to hold on to. He didn't respond, just lay there, curled up beneath the ferns, his face a picture of fragile sleep. I sat beside him all night. I didn't doze. I didn't blink for long. I just watched him breathe. Every time his chest moved, a tiny weight lifted. Every time it paused, I leaned in with terror clenching my heart. I prayed, not the kind of prayer you say in church, all memorized and clean. No, this was raw, ugly, wordless, a bargain with whatever force might be listening. I hadn't spoken to God in years. But that night, I begged. I promised. I swore if Micah made it, I would become the man he deserved. And I swore I would make the people who did this pay. By morning, the fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't gotten worse. That, in this twisted new war. Micah opened his eyes mid-morning. They were glassy, but he focused. "Water," he croaked. I gave him what I had. He drank slowly. "Are we still exploring?" he asked. It almost broke me. I nodded. "Yeah, buddy. Still exploring. Just taking a little rest." He nodded and closed his eyes again. I could tell he wanted to believe me, and maybe he did. Kids have to. That's how they survive the hard parts of the world. I cleaned him up as best I could, wiped his forehead with the edge of my shirt, now damp from stream water. I even tried to make a little shade tint with branches and my jacket. That day moved slowly. The fire kept dying. The wind picked up. I stayed close to Micah, gathering more berries, rationing water. By late afternoon, his fever finally began to drop. He was sweating less, his skin cooler. I didn't cheer. I just exhaled. I leaned back against a tree, the bark rough against my back, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to cry. Not loud. Not for long. Just enough to let the weight shift slightly off my chest. Silent tears for a man who had lost everything but the one thing that still made him human. I didn't sleep that night either, but I did close my eyes for a while, just listening to him breathe. And sometime before dawn, I felt it. Something inside me had changed. It wasn't rage. I'd had that already. It wasn't grief. That too had come and gone in waves. No, this was colder. Heavier. Like steel. I would get us out. And when I did, I wasn't going to simply call the police. I wasn't going to scream at them or plead for justice. I was going to dismantle their lives. Piece by piece. They didn't just abandon me. They abandoned Micah. Chapter. And that was unforgivable. I looked at my son curled beside the firelight, still wrapped in that silver blanket, and I made a vow to the trees, the wind, and whatever God had listened to me in the dark. They wanted me dead, but I was more alive now than I'd ever been. Day 6 began with the silence of decision. Micah was finally resting better, the fever having passed, but he was still weak. His cheeks were hollow, sunken with exhaustion. I gave him water and the last of the spruce tips we had saved, and for the first time in days, he looked up at me without the glaze of illness in his gaze. "Where are we going today, Dad?" he asked, his voice still raspy but stronger. "Somewhere better," I said. And I meant it. The ridge we had camped near the night before sloped upward into a range of hills. I'd spent the last few days studying the landscape with the old trail map I found buried under the seat of my pack. It was frayed, almost useless, but I could make out the basic features. Streams, elevations, symbols for cabins and ranger stations. We weren't where we started anymore. I was sure of that. But if I read the terrain right, the smoke I had seen the evening before was a fire tower or possibly an old ranger lookout. If it was active, it meant rescue. If it wasn't, it was still shelter. Either way, it was hope. Micah tried to stand on his own but winced. His right leg had been bothering him since the hike on day 2. He never complained, not once, but I could see the way he shifted his weight, the grimace he thought I didn't notice. I took off my belt and looped it through the straps of his pack and mine, fashioning a makeshift sling around his shoulders and waist so I could carry some of his weight. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to get him moving. We climbed slowly. The incline was steep, littered with fallen branches and patches of loose rock. My boots slipped more than once, but I caught myself. I had to. I couldn't fall with him depending on me. He was silent for most of the climb, saving his breath. Every so often, I heard a quiet, "You okay, Dad?" "Yeah," I'd grunt back. "You?" "Yeah." We reached a small ledge by midday and paused. I gave him some water, let him rest in the shade while I climbed a little higher to scan the horizon. And there it was. Smoke. A thin gray column rising over the ridge to the north. Controlled, steady. Not wild like a fire, but purposeful. A signal. A camp. Maybe even a tower. I felt my knees weaken, but not from fear. We were close. I slid back down to Micah and smiled. "See that smoke up there?" He nodded slowly. "We're going there." He leaned against me, and I could feel the relief in his small frame. We pressed on. The climb was brutal. My legs screamed. My lungs burned. My hands were torn from grasping branches, scraping bark, lifting Micah every time the terrain got too steep. I never let go. Not once. At one point, the sling came undone and I slipped, landing hard on my side. My ribs protested. I bit down on the inside of my cheek and forced myself up. Micah was crying quietly. "I'm okay," I said, brushing myself off, breathing through the pain. "You're bleeding," he said, pointing to my elbow. "Just a scratch. We've come too far to stop now." The final stretch was the worst. A narrow path over jagged rock. One wrong step and we'd tumble into the ravine below. I told Micah to hold my shoulders tight. I took each step slow, one foot in front of the other, until we crested the hill. And then I saw it. A silver glint in the trees. Metal. A tower. It stood half-shrouded in evergreens, a fire lookout with aluminum siding and a faded red roof. Smoke curled from a chimney pipe. There was life here, or at least a chance of it. I almost collapsed from the sight. "That's it," I said. "That's where we're going. We descended the final slope slowly. The forest grew quieter, like even it was watching. I knocked on the door with trembling hands, shouting. No answer. I circled the base and found a hatch to a staircase leading up. I hoisted Micah onto my back and climbed. At the top, the door creaked open with a groan. Empty, but not abandoned. Inside, a cot, a shelf with cans, beans, almonds, soup, a first aid kit, a flare gun. I nearly dropped to my knees. This was salvation. I laid Micah on the cot. He looked up at me with tired eyes. We made it, he whispered. I gave him almonds and water. Then I tended to his foot with iodine and gauze. He winced, but didn't cry. That night, I used the flare gun. I stood on the platform, pointed it to the sky, and fired. The flare hissed upward, blooming into a red flower of hope against the darkening sky. I watched it fade and waited. 30 minutes later, I heard it. The sound of rotor blades slicing through the silence. A helicopter. It emerged from behind the ridge, dipping low over the treetops. A spotlight cut through the branches, scanning. I waved both arms, shouted until my throat went raw. They saw us. The bird hovered, then descended slowly, kicking up dust and pine needles. A medic jumped out, ran to the tower, and pulled Micah into their arms. I followed, limping, dizzy. I don't remember being lifted into the chopper. I just remember Micah reaching for me, his small hand finding mine, and then black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital room. For in my arm, heart monitor beeping. Micah was asleep beside me, clean, warm, safe. I didn't know how many days had passed. A nurse came in. She called the doctor. But it wasn't the doctor who arrived first. It was a man in a dark suit, holding a badge. FBI. Mr. Ellis, he said. Do you know your wife filed for your death last week? I stared at him, the words not making sense. She what? He nodded slowly. We need to talk. And that was the moment I knew. They hadn't just abandoned us. They had tried to erase us. The hospital bed creaked beneath me as I tried to sit upright. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, stiff, bruised, hollowed out from the inside. But none of that mattered. Not now. Not after what the agent had just told me. My wife had filed for my death. Not missing. Not endangered. Dead. And not just mine, Micah's too. The man in the dark suit stood at the edge of the room, his arms crossed, badge clipped to his belt. His name was Agent Cole Monroe, and he had a folder under his arm that looked too thick to mean anything good. We received the insurance claim last Wednesday, he said. Your wife submitted it through an attorney. Claimed you went missing on a hike due to stress and mental instability. Said you took your son with you after a series of emotional outbursts. I wanted to laugh, but my throat was too dry. There were letters attached to the claim, he continued, opening the folder. Signed notes, supposedly from you. A will. Even a psychiatric report from a Dr. Wilkes. He dropped the copies on the tray table. They claimed you had a mental break, that you wandered off into the woods to die. I stared at the pages. I didn't need to read them to know they were fake. But there, in shaky cursive that looked almost like mine, were words I had never written. They thought we wouldn't find you, Cole said. They thought you wouldn't survive. My eyes shifted to Micah. He was still asleep in the chair beside me, wrapped in a hospital blanket and 4 in his arm. His face looked peaceful, but the thought of him listed as deceased in some government database made my blood run cold. How much? I asked. Cole raised an eyebrow. The insurance, I clarified. How much were we worth to her? $2.2 million, he said, and another $600,000 in a separate policy through Hollow Point Systems, the one tied to your ownership. I closed my eyes. And the others? I asked. Zane, Sierra, Brooke, all named in the investigation. All corroborated the story. He flipped to a page with Zane's signature. Your brother-in-law claimed he saw you leave the camp alone with Micah. Said you were distraught. Maribel backed it up with text messages that were conveniently saved. Sierra and Brooke said they stayed behind because they were uncomfortable. He paused. They even hired a notary to certify the new will. I laughed then. A bitter, broken sound. Let me guess, Maribel was the sole heir. Cole didn't smile. Correct. I leaned back against the pillows, my pulse thudding in my ears. We're compiling everything now, he continued. But the fact that you and your son are alive complicates their plan. You were supposed to disappear. It's a lot harder to press a claim when the body walks back into the world. I looked down at my hands. They were still scraped and dirt-stained. They left a child behind, I said. They walked away from him. That's not just fraud. It's attempted child endangerment. Cole said, nodding. Possibly more, depending on the DA. And now that the boys recovered enough to speak, we'll get a statement. But I need your help. Anything, I said. We need your full testimony. Everything from the trip. Every detail you remember. We'll pair it with the GPS data from the helicopter and the medical evaluations. If we build the timeline tight enough, we can dismantle their entire story. I nodded. And Maribel? Cole met my eyes. She hasn't been arrested yet. We didn't have enough until now. Something in me shifted. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. 3 days later, I was discharged from the hospital. Micah too. He clung to my side like a shadow as we stepped out into the sunlight. I was 20 pounds lighter, limping on my left side, and bruised everywhere, but I was upright. We were taken to a safe house while the investigation continued. Cole visited daily, walking me through documents, transcripts, surveillance footage, and timelines. We stitched together every lie they had built. We had the receipts. Hardware store purchases made days after we were supposedly lost, showing Maribel and Zane buying replacement gear. We had footage, Brooke at an ATM, withdrawing cash to pay the notary. We had a paper trail, digital signatures on the insurance claim, timestamped just 2 days after Micah and I had vanished. And we had the bombshell, Micah's voice, calm but clear, telling the child psychologist that he and Daddy went on a short walk and came back to an empty campsite. When Cole heard the recording, he said, "That's it. That's what we needed." I asked one question. When do we bring them in? He looked at his watch. We already are. That afternoon, they executed the warrants. Zane was picked up from a gym downtown. Sierra was cornered in her classroom. She taught 4th grade. God help those kids. Brooke was pulled off a red-eye flight to Vegas. And Maribel? She was at brunch, wearing my mother's earrings, laughing. Cole showed me the footage later. She didn't even flinch when they read the charges, just calmly placed her mimosa on the table and asked if she needed to finish paying the bill. You're under arrest for insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted child endangerment, and falsifying legal documents, the agent had said. I understand, she replied, like they were discussing a parking ticket. When she saw the cameras outside, though, her face changed. That was the moment it hit her. I was alive, and I was coming for everything. I stood outside the courtroom in a navy suit that barely fit anymore, the fabric looser than it should have been, my reflection in the courthouse window looking unfamiliar. Micah was with my sister inside, reading a comic book quietly on one of the benches. He didn't need to hear any of this. He'd lived through enough already. Inside the courtroom, my wife sat surrounded by the very people she once swore were just old friends. Zane, with his arms crossed like he owned the room. Sierra in her charcoal blazer and dark sunglasses like this was some sort of fashion show. Brooke chewing gum, disinterested as ever. And Maribel, my wife, sitting front and center like this was a job interview and not a reckoning. She didn't look at me when I walked in. None of them did. My lawyer, Marcy Lynn, dropped a thick folder in front of the judge with a sound that made the room flinch. Your Honor, she began, what you are about to review isn't simply evidence of a forged will or a fraudulent insurance claim. It is evidence of a coordinated attempt to profit from the staged disappearance and presumed death of my client and his 10-year-old son. The judge, an older man with a lined face and heavy eyes, nodded. Proceed. Marcy opened the folder. First came the surveillance photos. Maribel and Zane at the hardware store, buying rope, tarps, water jugs, and trail supplies, 2 days after Micah and I had gone missing. Then came the receipts, gas station logs, credit card swipes, timestamps that didn't align with their original statements. After that, the audio. A voicemail Maribel had left on Sierra's phone a day before the camping trip. Make sure the gear is packed in Zane's car. Rowan's gonna take the bait. Micah too. The courtroom was silent. Not a cough. Not a whisper. The judge leaned forward. Play that again. Marcy did. And this time, it landed harder. Then came the forged psychiatric letters, supposedly written by a Dr. Wilkes, claiming I'd shown signs of emotional breakdown, paranoia, instability. The judge narrowed his eyes. We've subpoenaed Dr. Wilkes. He confirmed he's never met my client. His signature was copied from an unrelated document, and the license number listed is for a pediatrician in another state. Maribel shifted in her seat for the first time. Zane stopped tapping his foot. Marcy wasn't done. She handed over the signed will that claimed I had revised my estate 6 days before the trip, leaving everything to Maribel. "And the notary?" the judge asked. "She's here, Your Honor," Marcy said. A woman in her early 50s took the stand. Her voice shook at first, but steadied quickly. "I was paid under the table to stamp the document. I never witnessed a signature. I never met Rowan Ellis. I was told it was a rush job for a man leaving the country." She started to cry. "I didn't know there was a child involved." The judge removed his glasses. "Thank you, Miss Dyer." Zane muttered something under his breath. Brooke looked at the ceiling like it could offer her a way out. Sierra finally took off her sunglasses. And Maribel stared straight ahead. Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand slowly. Every step reminded me of the ache in my ribs that never quite healed. I sat down and looked around the courtroom. "My name is Rowan Ellis," I began. "And what happened to me and my son wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. It was a plan, a deliberate plan to remove me from my own life." I told the court everything. The trip, the hike, the note, the food rationing, the fever, the fire tower, the flare. But when I got to the part about Micah asking for his mother, I had to stop. I looked at Maribel then. "He asked for you," I said softly, "while he burned with fever, while he lay in the dirt, thinking you were coming back. And you weren't." Marcy touched my shoulder. I nodded and turned back to the judge. "We survived because we had to. But I want it on record. The people sitting over there didn't just try to steal my company. They tried to erase me. And they were willing to let a child die to do it." The silence afterward was thick. The judge called a recess. During the break, Maribel finally looked at me. Her eyes were cold. Not regretful. Not ashamed. Just calculating. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. "Mr. Ellis, any comment on the trial?" one asked. I paused, then said, "They tried to replace me. Now let's make sure they don't get away with it." Back inside, the judge announced his ruling. The evidence presented establishes clear grounds for a criminal trial. This court finds sufficient cause to move forward with formal charges: insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted endangerment of a minor, and falsification of legal documents. He looked directly at the defendants. "You are remanded into custody until your trial date is set." Zane stood up to protest but was cut off by two bailiffs. Brooke looked stunned. Sierra began crying. And Maribel? She finally blinked. I walked out of that courtroom not as a victim, but as a man who had pulled his son from the jaws of betrayal and brought the truth into the light. We weren't just left behind. We were supposed to be gone, but we came back stronger. The trial began on a wet Monday morning, the kind of gray that seeps into your bones before you even step outside. I adjusted Micah's tie in the back row of the courtroom and gave him a reassuring nod. He wasn't testifying, thank God, but he wanted to be there. He said he needed to see it through. So did I. Maribel entered first, flanked by her attorney. No makeup, hair tied back in a low bun. She wore a beige blazer 2 sizes too big. It was an act, and I saw right through it. She sat without looking at anyone, not even me. Zane shuffled in next, his cocky energy finally deflated. Sierra followed, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Brooke barely raised her head. The four of them looked like ghosts in their own horror story. Marcy Lynn began the opening statement. This is not simply about fraud. This is about betrayal of the deepest kind. About 4 adults, including a mother, who left a child and his father in the wilderness to die, not because of desperation, but for money. The prosecutor called me as the first witness. Again, I retold the story, this time not just. One juror, a woman in a green blouse, wiped a tear from her cheek when I described carrying Micah up the ridge. Another nodded silently when I talked about boiling stream water, when I described the flare arcing into the sky. Then came the evidence. Email threads between Sierra and Brooke. Brooke, is it done yet? Sierra, he won't last 10 days out there. Not with a kid. Laughter emojis. Then text from Zane to Maribel. Zane, we'll file Monday. The sooner the better. Maribel, use the second draft of the psych letter. The one with the family history section. That text hit the jury like a slap. When the notary took the stand again, she detailed how Sierra arranged the meeting at a diner and paid her $2,000 in cash. They said it was urgent, that Rowan was leaving the country and didn't trust banks. Maribel's attorney tried to paint her as a manipulated woman, caught up in something orchestrated by her reckless brother and pressured friends. But then the prosecutor pulled out the real card. A video. Security footage from 3 days before the trip. Maribel alone. At a bank. Speaking to a financial advisor about liquidating the trust left by my late grandfather, the one she claimed to know nothing about. He won't need it, she had said on camera. He's going through something. The jury didn't buy her performance. Not after that. Zane's attorney attempted damage control, claiming his client believed I was suicidal and had simply panicked. The jury was then shown a clip from Zane's podcast, a cringeworthy episode where he joked about camping and letting nature take care of things. Don't leave your brother-in-law in the woods unless you're ready to cash out, he'd said. The room froze. Sierra and Brooke didn't even try to defend themselves. Their lawyers went for plea bargains mid-trial, hoping to avoid full sentences. Too late. The damage was done. When the time came for closing arguments, Marcy stood tall. They didn't just try to steal money. They tried to erase a man. And worse, they tried to erase a child's future. They gambled that no one would come looking, that the wilderness would do the work for them. But the wilderness didn't. Rowan Ellis came back. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdicts: Maribel, guilty on all counts. Zane, guilty. Sierra, guilty. Brooke, guilty. I held Micah's hand in the front row as the judge delivered sentencing. This court has never seen such a blatant, calculated abuse of trust. For the attempted endangerment of a minor, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the falsification of federal documents, the following sentences are imposed. Maribel, 15 years, eligible for parole after 10. Zane, 12 years. Sierra and Brooke, 10 years each. As they were led away, handcuffed and silent, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Outside, reporters swarmed. A microphone was thrust in my face. Mr. Ellis, how do you feel? What do you want the public to know? I looked down at Micah. 10 days in the woods taught me who my real family is, I said. And it's not defined by blood. It's defined by who shows up, who stays, who fights. I didn't answer any more questions. I just took Micah's hand and walked away. We weren't victims anymore. We were survivors. And no one would ever erase us again. 10 days. That's how long Micah and I had spent in the wilderness. 10 days surviving on scraps and instinct, on the invisible thread between father and son. 10 days being erased. And now it had taken 10 hours to sentence them. 10 days of pain for 10 years behind bars. The headlines rolled in fast. Mother sentenced in fraud plot against husband and son. Ellis family betrayal uncovered in wilderness survival case. Software CEO survives murder plot, leads to convictions of 4. Every variation, every photo, every quote. I read none of it. I didn't need to. I was living the story every day. The house we moved into wasn't large, but it was ours. A 2-bedroom home near the coast, a small front porch, and a yard where Micah could finally be a child again. I painted his room in sky blue. Let him pick the bedding himself. Dinosaurs, of course. A creature that had once ruled the earth but still managed to disappear. Micah got a dog. A shaggy brown rescue he named Comet. They became instant friends. The kind of bond only a boy and a dog can understand. Comet followed him everywhere. Even waited outside the bathroom door. Hollow Point Systems was still mine. Maribel had tried to claim ownership, but the courts threw that out before it even made it past preliminary motions. Her forged documents, her falsified stake gone. I resumed operations quietly, no outside investors, just a skeleton crew of people who had always believed in the core product. We didn't make headlines. We didn't need to. Every line of code I wrote now felt like rebuilding a bone that had once been shattered. Micah was doing better. He smiled more, laughed more, went to bed without asking if someone was going to take him again. But every now and then, I caught him staring off, holding the old hiking compass I gave him, the one we used to follow the stream. He still carried it in his pocket sometimes, like a talisman. One night, we sat on the back porch after dinner. I grilled chicken. He helped slice cucumbers. We ate with Comet at our feet and a breeze moving through the tall grass beyond the fence. Micah looked up at me, voice small. Why did they do it, Dad? I didn't pretend not to know what he meant. I set my plate down. Because they thought we were in the way, I said quietly. Because they believed their lives would be easier without us. He nodded like he'd already guessed that. But we weren't in the way, he said, more firmly now. I looked at him, at his firm little jaw, and the fierce glint in his eye, and I saw the man he might become someday. A man who knew how to stand when everyone else expected him to fall. No, I said. We weren't. The silence after that was full of peace. Later that week, we drove into town to visit my sister. Micah wore his favorite hoodie, the one with a stitched compass on the sleeve. We stopped at a small bookstore on the way, and he wandered to the back where they kept old field guides. When I joined him, he held up a worn copy of a wilderness survival manual. "So next time," he said, grinning, "you don't have to guess." I laughed, tousled his hair. "There better not be a next time," I said. "Yeah," he said, "but if there is, I'll be ready." He would be. More than I ever was. At night, I sometimes lay awake staring at the ceiling. I didn't dream about the forest. Not anymore. But I remembered it. The cold. The hunger. The sound of my son breathing beside me in the dark. The moment I thought I might lose him. And the moment I knew I never would. People asked me if I was going to change my name. If I was going to disappear and rebuild somewhere else. But I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to live. Openly. Fully. On my terms. The justice system had done its part. But healing? That was on us. And we were doing it. One breakfast. One walk with Comet. One line of code. One smile. The past was always there, sure. But so was the future. And we were writing it ourselves now. Micah started drawing again. He showed me a picture one evening while I was working in the garage. It was of a man and a boy on a hill, a fire behind them and stars above. "That's us," he said. "What's the fire mean?" I asked. He thought about it. "It means we didn't go out." I smiled, throat tight. "No, we didn't. And we never would." The courthouse felt colder than it had during the pretrial. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the fact that this time, we weren't just making accusations. This time, we were sealing fates. The trial had ended. The sentencing was done. But what followed was a stretch of 10 days that felt like walking through a museum of everything we'd survived. Each day brought a new news article, a new message request, a new apology from someone who had once doubted me. People I hadn't heard from in years reached out. High school classmates. Former coworkers. A cousin who once told me I was boring. They said things like, "We always knew you were strong," or, "I can't believe they did that to you." But none of them were there when Micah cried himself to sleep on a bed of moss. None of them were there when I cut my hand open splitting kindling with a pocket knife that was too dull, too small. None of them sat by the fire we built out of desperation and listened to the forest breathe like it was deciding whether we deserved to survive. 10 days. That was how long we had lasted in the wild. 10 days of eating wild roots, of sucking dew off leaves when our water ran out. 10 days of carrying my son on my back when his fever made him too weak to walk. 10 days of staring into the dark, waiting for some sound, some movement. That would mean either death or rescue. And now, 10 days of the world trying to wrap it all up with a bow. 10 days of press conferences, of victim statements, of being called resilient like it was some compliment instead of a scar. 10 days of not sleeping because the nightmares still came like thunder rolling just out of reach. Micah handled it better than I did. Or maybe he was just more honest about it. He asked questions. Lots of them. Questions I didn't always know how to answer. "Why did they do it?" he asked one night, sitting cross-legged on his bed with a flashlight balanced under his chin. I sat at the edge of the mattress, staring at the cracks in the hardwood floor. "Because they thought we were in the way," I said. "Because some people only see others as obstacles." "But we weren't hurting them," he said. "No, we weren't. But we were inconvenient. And to people like that, inconvenience is enough." He was quiet for a while. "I think they thought you wouldn't fight back." I looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "Because they always talk over you. At dinners. At parties. You used to go quiet when they joked. They thought you were weak." It was the kind of observation that made my stomach turn. Because it was true. I had let myself shrink in that family, in that marriage. Bit by bit. Year by year. I told myself it was easier. For Micah. For peace. For love. But really, it was fear. Fear of being too much. Fear of being alone. They fed off that. Until the woods stripped everything else away and left me with nothing but instinct. Day 4 of the post-trial week, I visited the Hollow Point office. What was left of it? The building had been empty since the restructuring. The board Maribel tried to claim a share of was dissolved. The documents she'd submitted to prove co-ownership had been invalidated in court. Fraud, forged signatures, misrepresentation. But the damage had still been done. I walked past empty desks, past dry plants and cracked ceramic pots. The server room hummed quietly, like a living thing trying to remember its purpose. I stood in the middle of the main room and just listened. I remembered staying late in this space. Pulling Micah in a wagon when he was a toddler. Maribel used to drop him off with a kiss on the head and then vanish to her yoga retreats or networking dinners. I used to think we were building something together, but only one of us was actually building. The other was already digging escape tunnels. I spent the next 2 days reclaiming what was mine. I reactivated the core infrastructure, called 3 of my old engineers. 2 said yes immediately. The third, Anita, cried when she heard my voice. "I thought you were gone, Rowan. I was at your memorial." I laughed softly. "So was I, just in the trees. We started from scratch." I gave them access to the architecture. I cleared my calendar. No meetings, no external investors, just a new version of the company that bore my fingerprints instead of compromise. On day 6, I got a letter from Maribel. It came from my lawyer, typed but signed in her hand. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, that she didn't even fully understand what made her go through with it, that the idea took root over time and grew like mold in the corners of their conversations. She claimed it started as a joke. What if he just disappeared? And then Zane ran with it. Sierra encouraged it. Brooke offered logistics. And she agreed. No apology. Just that. A confession of sorts. Or maybe just a desperate attempt to rewrite her role in the narrative before history sealed it. She ended it with a question. "How is Micah?" I didn't reply, because she didn't deserve to know. Day 7, I took Micah to the beach. He ran ahead with Comet chasing seagulls. I sat on a dune, watching the 2 of them zigzag across the wet sand. A woman from the neighborhood sat down beside me. Her name was Rachel. She'd brought her daughter to play. "You look like you're carrying a whole mountain on your back," she said gently. "Feels more like a forest," I replied. She didn't ask questions, just offered me a bottle of water in silence. Sometimes that's all you need. Day 8, Micah had a nightmare. I woke up to him calling my name, his small voice cracking. "The trees were eating the stars," he whispered. "And you disappeared again." I sat beside him until his breathing slowed. Then I pulled the sleeping bag from the closet and camped on his floor for the rest of the night. Neither of us said anything more. Day 9, the media frenzy died down. The story that had once burned through headlines like wildfire began to flicker out. Another scandal. Another politician. Another tragedy. We were yesterday's miracle. But that was fine, because we weren't built for the spotlight. We were built for the fire. Day 10, we built a fort in the living room. Not because we were hiding, but because we could. Micah brought blankets and flashlights. I brought snacks. Comet guarded the entrance like a loyal knight. We read a book about explorers who mapped unknown lands. Micah stopped at a page and said, "You know, we did that." Did what? Survived. Like them. Only no one drew our map. We made it up. I looked at him. This boy who had carried no weapon but courage. "Yeah," I said. "We made it up. And we survived." He nodded. 10 days, Dad. We beat 10 days. That's like 100 in real life. He wasn't wrong. Those 10 days didn't just test us. They made us. 10 days of hell had earned us this life. And I would never let anyone take it away again. At my wife's company's Christmas party, my wife's CEO held my wife's waist and laughing. He pointed to me and said, "You're just another sad trophy she keeps in the basement. Broke, clingy, and forgettable." Everyone laughed, including my wife, except me. I just smiled and said to the CEO, "You are just another loser who was about to lose 95% share of his company." The moment I said those words, his face turned pale. You know that feeling when you're at a party where everyone's pretending to have fun, but you can smell the BS from a mile away? Yeah, that was me tonight, standing in the corner of this ridiculously overpriced ballroom like some kind of wallflower at prom. Sienna's company Christmas party was supposed to be our night out, a chance to actually dress up and pretend we were fancy people for a few hours. Instead, I felt like I was watching a really bad reality show where everyone was trying way too hard to impress each other. The ballroom was decked out like someone had thrown up Christmas all over the place. We're talking chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's cars, ice sculptures that were already melting into expensive puddles, and enough champagne flowing to fill a small swimming pool. The whole place screamed, "Look how successful we are," in that obnoxious way that makes you want to roll your eyes so hard they fall out of your head. I nursed my whiskey, the good stuff, not the cheap crap they usually serve at these corporate shindigs, and watched Sienna work the room. She was in her element, all confident smiles and perfectly timed laughs. My wife could charm the pants off a scarecrow when she wanted to. And tonight, she was definitely bringing her A game. Me? I was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, just standing there trying to look like I belonged. The worst part wasn't the fake conversations about quarterly reports or the pretentious small talk about vacation homes in the Hamptons. No, the worst part was feeling invisible. You ever been in a room full of people and felt completely alone? That was me, drowning in a sea of expensive suits and designer dresses, wondering why I'd bothered putting on my best tie for this circus. Then Carson Vance showed up. If there was ever a guy who looked like he stepped straight out of a douchebag CEO starter pack, it was Carson. Picture this. Perfectly styled hair that probably required more product than a Vegas showgirl. Teeth so white they could blind a pilot. And a smile that screamed, "I'm better than you, and we both know it." The dude wore his arrogance like a cheap cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. I watched him glide across the room like he owned the place, which, technically, he did. Stratos Tech was his baby, his golden goose, his ticket to the kind of wealth that lets you buy politicians for fun. He glad-handed his way through the crowd, dropping names and making promises he probably had no intention of keeping. When he reached Sienna, something inside my chest tightened. Not jealousy, exactly. More like that feeling you get when you see a car accident about to happen in slow motion. He slipped his arm around her waist with the casual confidence of a guy who'd never been told no in his entire privileged life. "Sienna, darling," he said, his voice carrying that fake warmth that made my skin crawl. "You look absolutely stunning tonight. Though I have to ask, where's that husband of yours hiding?" The crowd around them chuckled like he'd just told the funniest joke in the world. Sienna's laugh was bright and musical, the same one that used to make my heart skip a beat when we were dating. Now it just felt like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, Julian's around here somewhere," she said, her eyes scanning the room until they found me. For a split second, I thought I saw something apologetic in her expression. Then Carson followed her gaze, and his grin turned predatory. "Ah, there he is," Carson announced, his voice booming across the ballroom like he was calling out the winner of some twisted game show. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Julian Cross, the man who's mastered the art of being professionally unemployed." The laughter that followed hit me like a slap to the face. These people, Sienna's colleagues, her friends, people I'd smiled at and made small talk with for years, were eating it up like it was the entertainment portion of the evening. But Carson wasn't done. Oh no, he was just getting warmed up. He tightened his grip on Sienna's waist, pulling her closer like she was some kind of prize he'd won at a county fair. "You know what Julian is," he continued, his voice dripping with mock affection. "He's Sienna's little basement trophy. You know, the kind of guy who stays home, watches TV, and lives off his successful wife's hard work. Broke, clingy, and completely forgettable." The room erupted. People were practically falling over themselves laughing. Some woman in a sequin dress actually snorted champagne through her nose. Even the waiters were trying to hide their grins behind their trays. And then there was Sienna, my wife, the woman who'd promised to love and honor me, who'd sworn to have my back through thick and thin, threw her head back and laughed like Carson had just delivered the punchline of the century. Her laughter was the loudest of all, bright and clear and absolutely devastating. The room spun a little, not from the whiskey. I'd only had one drink, but from the sheer, crushing weight of betrayal. These people didn't know me. They didn't know what I'd done, what I'd built, what I'd sacrificed. But Sienna did. Or at least, she should have. The laughter started to die down, and Carson basked in the attention like a sunflower turning toward the light. He was probably already planning his next zinger, ready to milk this moment for all it was worth. That's when I decided I'd heard enough. I set my glass down on the nearest table. Crystal, of course, because Carson wouldn't know class if it bit him on his surgically enhanced ass, and walked toward the center of the room. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, their laughter fading into confused murmurs. Carson's grin faltered when he saw me approaching. Good. I wanted him off balance. I stopped directly in front of him, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne and the desperation underneath it. The room was dead silent now, everyone waiting to see what the basement trophy was going to do. I looked Carson straight in his artificially blue eyes and smiled. Not a bitter smile or an angry one, just calm, confident, and completely unshakable. "You know what, Carson?" I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. You're absolutely right. I am just a guy who's been hanging around in the basement. His grin returned, triumphant. He thought he'd won. But here's the thing about basements, I continued, my smile never wavering. That's where you keep all the really valuable stuff. And you, my friend, are just another loser who's about to lose 95% of his company. Carson's face went white. Not pale, not flushed. White as fresh snow, white as bleached bone, white as the lies he'd been telling himself about who really held the power in this room. The silence stretched on forever, and I walked away. Walking out of that ballroom felt like stepping out of a fever dream and into reality. The cool December air hit my face like a wake-up call, and for the first time all evening, I could actually breathe. Behind me, I could hear the stunned silence I'd left in my wake slowly giving way to confused chatter. Good. Let them choke on their champagne and expensive words. My footsteps echoed across the marble floor of the hotel lobby. Each click of my dress, shoes marking the distance between who they thought I was and who I really was. The doorman nodded as I passed, probably relieved to see someone leaving the pretentious circus upstairs. I didn't blame him. If I had to watch rich people play dress-up and backstab each other for a living, I'd probably develop a drinking problem. Julian, wait. And there it was, the sound of designer heels clicking frantically across marble, accompanied by the rustling of an expensive dress. Sienna was chasing after me like some kind of rom-com heroine. Except this wasn't cute or romantic. This was desperate damage control. I didn't slow down. Why should I? She'd had her chance to stand up for me up there, and instead she'd chosen to laugh along with the crowd like I was some kind of punchline. Now she wanted to talk? Now she cared about my feelings? Julian, please stop. Her voice was getting breathless, probably because running in those ridiculous heels was like trying to sprint in stilts. Part of me wanted to keep walking, to let her stumble after me in her fancy dress while I disappeared into the night like some mysterious stranger from a movie. But the other part of me, the part that still remembered why I'd fallen for her in the first place, made me stop. I turned around slowly, giving her time to catch up. She was slightly out of breath, her perfect hair showing the first signs of coming undone. Her cheeks were flushed, whether from embarrassment or exertion, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. What the hell was that supposed to mean? She demanded, her eyes flashing with a mixture of confusion and anger. What you said to Carson, about him losing his company. Julian, that doesn't make any sense. You can't just threaten people like that. I had to laugh. Not a bitter laugh this time, but genuine amusement at the sheer absurdity of the situation. Here was my wife, defending the man who'd just humiliated me in front of a room full of people. The same man who'd called me a broke, clingy basement trophy while she laughed along. Threaten him, I said, shaking my head. Sienna, that wasn't a threat. That was a promise. She stared at me like I'd just told her I was secretly an alien from Mars. Julian, you're scaring me. You're talking crazy. Carson owns Stratos Tech. He built that company from the ground up. You can't just... Can't what? I interrupted, my voice staying perfectly calm despite the storm brewing inside my chest. Can't tell the truth? Can't defend myself when your boss decides to turn me into his personal punching bag for the evening's entertainment? That's not what happened, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. We both knew exactly what had happened up there. Really? I stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at me. Because from where I was standing, it looked like my wife found it absolutely hilarious when another man called me a pathetic loser who lives off her success. The fight went out of her eyes for a moment, replaced by something that might have been guilt. But then her defensive walls went back up, and she crossed her arms like she was protecting herself from my words. You're being ridiculous, she said, but she couldn't meet my eyes when she said it. It was just a joke, Julian. Carson was just being. Carson, you know how he is at these things. Yeah, I do know how he is, I said quietly. The question is, do you know how I am? She frowned, clearly confused by the question. What's that supposed to mean? And there it was, the million-dollar question that proved everything I'd suspected for years. My own wife didn't know who I was. She didn't know what I'd done, what I'd built, what I was capable of. To her, I was exactly what Carson had said. A basement trophy, a kept man, a nobody who'd gotten lucky enough to marry above his station. It means, I said, turning back toward the parking garage, that you're about to find out. Julian, don't walk away from me. Her heels clicked frantically as she hurried to keep up. I deserve an explanation. If you know something about Carson's company, if you're planning something, you deserve an explanation? I stopped so suddenly she almost crashed into me. Sienna, 5 minutes ago you were laughing along while your boss made me the entertainment for the evening. Now you want explanations. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She knew I was right, but her pride wouldn't let her admit it. I wasn't laughing at you, she said weakly. It was awkward, Julian. I didn't know what to do. You didn't know what to do, I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air between us. When someone insults your husband, humiliates him in front of dozens of people, you didn't know what to do except laugh along. That's not fair. Fair. I shook my head. You want to talk about fair? Fair would have been you telling Carson to shut his mouth instead of encouraging him. Fair would have been you walking out with me instead of staying to enjoy the show. Fair would have been you knowing who you married instead of treating me like some kind of embarrassing secret. We'd reached my car, a modest sedan that suddenly looked like a rust bucket next to all the BMWs and Mercedes in the garage. Sienna probably saw it as proof of what Carson had said about me being broke. She had no idea that I could have bought and sold half the cars in that garage without making a dent in my portfolio. Julian, please, she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. I'm sorry. I should have defended you. I know that. But this thing with Carson, whatever you're planning, it's going to hurt both of us. My career, our future. Our future. I unlocked the car and opened the driver's side door. Sienna, after tonight, I'm not even sure we have a present, let alone a future. Her face went pale. You don't mean that. I looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. She was beautiful, successful, ambitious. Everything I'd thought I wanted in a partner. But she didn't know me. After all these years together, she had no idea who I really was. You laughed at me, I said quietly. In front of all those people, you laughed at me like I was nothing. Like I was exactly what he said I was. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, Sienna. I got into the car and started the engine. But don't worry. By tomorrow morning, you'll understand exactly what Carson meant when his face went white. I backed out of the parking space, leaving her standing there in her designer dress and uncomfortable shoes, looking lost and confused in the fluorescent lighting of the garage. She still didn't get it. She thought I was unemployed, that I lived off her salary, that I was some kind of house husband playing video games in our basement while she climbed the corporate ladder. She had no idea that the company paying her salary, the company Carson thought he owned, the company that had made them all rich, it was mine. And tomorrow, they were all going to remember why ghosts are so dangerous. Because nobody sees them coming. The drive home was therapeutic in that twisted way that only pure, unadulterated rage can be. I took the long way, letting the December night air cool my head while my hands gripped the steering wheel like I was trying to choke the life out of it. The radio was playing some sappy Christmas song about love and togetherness. Perfect soundtrack for the dumpster fire my marriage had just become. I switched it off. Tonight wasn't about holiday cheer and warm, fuzzy feelings. Tonight was about settling scores. Our house looked exactly the same as when I'd left it 3 hours ago, but somehow everything felt different. The perfectly manicured lawn, the tasteful holiday lights Sienna had insisted on hanging, the expensive cars in the driveway. It all felt like a stage set for a play I was no longer interested in performing. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house we'd bought together, wondering how long it would take before she realized that the mortgage payments came from accounts she'd never seen. Inside, the silence was deafening. No Sienna clicking around in her heels, no sound of her chattering on the phone with her work friends, no background noise from whatever reality TV show she was binge-watching that week. Just me, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and the weight of 5 years' worth of carefully constructed lies finally coming home to roost. I loosened my tie, the expensive one Sienna had picked out for me, claiming it made me look presentable, and headed straight for my office. Not the fancy home office upstairs that Sienna used for her important work calls, but the smaller room in the basement that everyone assumed was where I played video games and pretended to be busy. The irony wasn't lost on me. Carson had called me a basement trophy, and technically, he wasn't wrong. All my most valuable stuff really was in the basement. The office looked exactly like what you'd expect from a guy who supposedly didn't work. A beat-up desk I'd bought at a garage sale, a gaming chair that had seen better days, a couple of monitors that most people would assume were for entertainment purposes. What they couldn't see was that those gaming monitors were connected to servers worth more than most people's annual salaries, running algorithms that had made me rich enough to buy Carson's company as a hobby. But tonight wasn't about the computers or the trading algorithms or the crypto wallets that held enough digital currency to fund a small country's infrastructure. Tonight was about the old-fashioned, analog proof that would turn Carson's world upside down and inside out. I walked over to the bookshelf, the one filled with technical manuals and programming guides that Sienna always complained made the room look nerdy. She had no idea that half those books were hollowed out, containing backup drives and encrypted storage devices that held the keys to more wealth than she could imagine. But I wasn't after the digital stuff tonight. The bookshelf itself was the real treasure. I pulled out 3 specific books: Advanced Database Management, Network Security Protocols, and Corporate Finance for Dummies. The last one always made me chuckle. If anyone had bothered to actually look at it, they might have wondered why a supposedly unemployed guy owned a book about corporate finance. But nobody ever looked. People see what they expect to see, and they expected to see a loser's collection of random books. The books triggered a mechanism I'd had installed when we first moved in. The entire middle section of the bookshelf swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a wall safe that would have made a Swiss banker jealous. Biometric scanner, keypad, the works. This wasn't some Home Depot special you could crack with a crowbar and bad attitude. This was industrial-grade security for industrial-grade secrets. I pressed my thumb to the scanner, punched in a code that included Sienna's birthday. Yeah, I'm sentimental like that, and listened to the satisfying chunk of multiple deadbolts retracting. The safe door swung open, revealing the paper trail that would turn tonight's humiliation into tomorrow's revenge. The documents were organized in labeled folders, each one representing a different phase of my carefully orchestrated disappearing act. Novagrid's sale contained the paperwork from when I'd sold my first company to a tech conglomerate for more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. Investment Portfolio held the records of how I'd turned that money into even more money through a combination of smart investments, lucky breaks, and an almost supernatural ability to spot trends before they became obvious. But the folder I was really after was labeled Stratos Tech Acquisition. Inside was the complete paper trail of how I'd quietly, methodically, and completely legally bought 95% of Carson's company over the course of 3 years. Shell companies, dummy corporations, offshore investment funds. I'd used every trick in the book to hide my identity while systematically purchasing shares from anyone willing to sell. The beautiful thing about Carson was that he was so arrogant, so convinced of his own brilliance, that he'd never bothered to properly investigate who was buying up his company. He'd been too busy playing CEO, making speeches, and apparently insulting people's husbands at Christmas parties to notice that someone was quietly pulling the rug out from under his feet. I spread the documents across my desk like I was planning a military campaign. The original merger documents from when Carson thought he was selling a small stake to raise capital. The trust agreements that technically made me the silent partner while letting him keep the CEO title. The board resolutions that gave me ultimate decision-making power whenever I chose to exercise it. My personal favorite was the clause buried on page 47 of the main contract, the one that allowed me to remove any executive for conduct detrimental to company interests. Carson's lawyer had probably figured it was standard boilerplate language. Carson himself had definitely never read that far. Big mistake. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for, Priya Lang. My lawyer, my friend, and the only person who knew exactly how rich and powerful I really was. She'd been with me since the early days of Novagrid, back when I was just another programmer with big dreams and bigger ambitions. She'd helped me navigate the sale, the investments, and the elaborate shell game that had made me the ghost owner of Stratos Tech. It was late, almost midnight, but Priya was a night owl, and this was the kind of call she'd been expecting for years. She answered on the second ring. Well, Julian Cross finally ready to come out of the shadows. It's time, I said, my voice steadier than it had been all evening. What finally pushed you over the edge? She asked, and I could hear the amusement in her voice. Let me guess, Carson said something stupid at a party? Something like that. And Sienna? I looked at the wedding photo on my desk, the happy couple who thought they knew each other, who thought they had their whole lives figured out. Sienna laughed. There was a long pause. Priya had met Sienna, had watched our relationship develop, had probably seen this coming from a mile away. She was too professional to say, "I told you so," but I could feel it in the silence. "All right," she said finally. "No more Mr. Nice Guy. No more hiding in the basement. Tomorrow, we remind everyone why they should be careful about making jokes at other people's expense." "No more shadows," I agreed. "This is going to get messy, Julian. Are you sure you're ready for the fallout?" I looked at the contracts spread across my desk, then at the empty house around me, then at the wedding ring on my finger that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Priya," I said, "I've been ready for this moment for 5 years. It's time everyone learned that the quiet guy in the corner isn't always the one you should ignore. Then let's burn it all down." I hung up and carefully returned the documents to their folders, but I left the safe open. Tomorrow, I wouldn't need to hide anymore. Carson wanted to call me a basement trophy? Fine. But he was about to learn that sometimes the trophy is worth more than everything else combined. Morning came way too early, but I was already awake. Hell, I'd been awake since about 4 a.m., sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring out the window and watching the world wake up. Funny how everything looks different when you're about to blow up someone's life. The sunrise seemed brighter, the birds sounded happier, and even my neighbor's ugly-ass lawn gnome looked like it was smiling at me. Sienna had come home around 2 in the morning, probably after spending hours at some all-night diner with her work friends, trying to figure out what the hell had happened at the party. I'd heard her heels clicking across the hardwood floor, heard her pause outside my office door like she was thinking about knocking, then heard her trudge upstairs to what I was pretty sure would be the guest bedroom. Smart move. I wasn't in the mood for round 2 of Julian's having a breakdown. By 7 a.m., I was showered, dressed in my best, I'm about to ruin someone's day outfit. Dark suit, red tie, shoes that could cut glass, and ready to watch Carson's world come crashing down around his perfectly styled ears. Priya had texted me at 5:30, papers filed, audit approved. May God have mercy on his soul, because we won't. I love that woman. Not in a romantic way. She was happily married to a tax attorney who could make the IRS cry, but in the way you love a samurai who's about to help you commit corporate seppuku on your enemies. Stratos Tech's headquarters looked exactly like what you'd expect from a company run by a guy who thought he was the next Steve Jobs. All glass and steel and pretentious architecture that screamed, "We're innovative," without actually innovating anything. I'd been in the building exactly 3 times since I'd started buying up shares. Always as Sienna's +1 at some boring corporate function. Always treated like the unemployed husband who was lucky to be there. Today was going to be different. I didn't go through the main entrance. Why would I? Instead, I headed straight for the executive parking garage, where my keycard, the one I'd had made years ago but never used, got me past security like I belonged there. Which, technically I did. I owned the damn place. The elevator ride to the 15th floor was smooth and quiet, giving me time to think about what Carson was probably doing right about now. If I knew him, and unfortunately, I did. He was sitting in his corner office with the view of the city, drinking his overpriced organic coffee and reading reports about how brilliant he was. He probably hadn't given last night's party another thought. Guys like Carson never did. They dropped their little verbal bombs, enjoyed the explosion, then moved on to the next target without ever considering that someone might drop a bigger bomb right back. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and I stepped into the executive suite like I owned the place. Because, again, I did. The first person I saw was Janet Morrison, Carson's assistant and the unofficial keeper of all Stratos Tech gossip. She was about 50, had been with the company since before Carson took over, and had the kind of poker face that made her dangerous at the company Christmas parties. She looked up from her computer as I approached, and I could see the exact moment she recognized me. "Mr. Cross?" she said, confusion written all over her face. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Vance isn't expecting." "That's okay, Janet," I said with a smile that was probably a little too cheerful for 8 in the morning. "He's not expecting a lot of things today." Before she could respond, I heard the sound of multiple pairs of expensive shoes clicking across marble floors. Priya appeared around the corner, followed by 2 guys in suits who looked like they ate corporate malfeasance for breakfast and asked for seconds. The audit team had arrived. "Good morning, Mr. Cross," Priya said, her voice carrying just enough volume that everyone in the vicinity could hear. "I trust you're ready for today's meeting?" "Absolutely," I replied, still wearing that probably too cheerful smile. "Is Mr. Vance available?" Janet looked back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. I can check if he's free." "Oh, don't bother," Priya said, pulling out a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "This is an official audit notice. Mr. Vance's availability is no longer really his choice." The color drained from Janet's face. She'd been around corporate America long enough to know that when lawyers showed up with audit teams, somebody was about to have a very bad day. "Audit?" she stammered. "I don't understand. Who authorized?" "The primary shareholder," I said simply. And there it was. The moment when Janet Morrison, who knew every secret and scandal in the building, who had probably fielded 1,000 calls from board members and investors over the years, realized that she had no idea who the primary shareholder actually was. I'll let Mr. Vance know you're here," she said weakly, reaching for her phone. "You do that," Priya said. "And while you're at it, you might want to let him know that we'll be examining all executive compensation packages, personal use of corporate resources, and any irregularities in his business practices over the past 5 years." Through the glass walls of Carson's office, I could see him on a phone call, gesturing wildly with his free hand like he was conducting an orchestra. He looked confident, relaxed, completely unaware that his world was about to get turned inside out. My phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number, but I knew who it was before I even looked. "Julian, please call me. We need to talk about last night." "Sienna." I showed the message to Priya, who read it and raised an eyebrow. "Timing," she said dryly. "Yeah, well, she had her chance to talk last night," I replied, sliding the phone back into my pocket. "Right about the time she was laughing at her husband getting humiliated. Should we wait for her to get here? This is going to affect her too." I thought about that for a moment. Sienna worked in marketing 3 floors down from the executive suite. She was probably at her desk right now, drinking her skinny latte and trying to pretend last night never happened. When the audit hit, when Carson got fired, when the whole house of cards came tumbling down, her job would probably be safe. I wasn't vindictive enough to destroy innocent people just because my marriage was circling the drain. But I also wasn't about to put this on hold just to spare her feelings. "She made her choice," I said. "Now she gets to live with the consequences." Janet hung up her phone and looked at us with the expression of someone who'd just been asked to schedule her own execution. "Mr. Vance will see you now," she said quietly. I could see Carson through the glass walls, straightening his tie and putting on his game face. He probably thought this was just another meeting, another chance to charm and schmooze his way through whatever minor inconvenience had showed up at his door. He had no idea that the minor inconvenience owned him. "After you," Priya said, gesturing toward Carson's office. As we walked toward the door, I caught sight of another familiar face in the hallway. Layla Chun, head of software development and the smartest person in the building that nobody ever listened to. She was carrying a tablet and a coffee cup, probably heading to another meeting where Carson would ignore her suggestions and take credit for her ideas. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw something there. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. She'd always been sharp enough to notice things other people missed. I made a mental note to talk to her later. After all, every kingdom needed a new ruler when the old king got overthrown. And Carson Vance's reign was about to come to a very abrupt end. Carson's office was exactly what you'd expect from a guy who thought he was the king of Silicon Valley. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a desk the size of a small aircraft carrier, and enough awards and trophies scattered around to make you think he'd won the Nobel Prize for being awesome. The whole place screamed, "Look how successful I am," in that desperate way that always made me wonder who he was trying to convince. He was standing behind his desk when we walked in, wearing what I like to call his CEO power pose, shoulders back, chin up, fake smile cranked to 11. The guy probably practiced that look in the mirror every morning while telling himself he was God's gift to the tech industry. "Julian," he said, his voice booming with fake enthusiasm. What a pleasant surprise. Though I have to say, after last night's interesting conversation, I wasn't expecting to see you here so soon. I could see the sweat starting to form on his forehead despite the confident act. Good. Let him squirm. Carson, I replied, my voice steady as a rock. I figured it was time we had a proper chat about business. His eyes flicked to Priya and the audit team behind me, and his smile faltered just a bit. Business? Julian, I hate to break it to you, but you don't exactly have any business here. This is my company. Funny you should mention that, Priya said, stepping forward and dropping that thick manila folder on his pristine desk with a satisfying thunk. We're actually here to discuss exactly whose company this is. Carson's face went from confident to confused to slightly panicked in about 3 seconds flat. It was like watching a car accident in slow motion, except way more entertaining. I'm sorry, but who are you people? He asked, his voice climbing about half an octave higher than usual. Priya Lang, attorney for Mr. Cross, she said, flipping open the folder and spreading documents across his desk like she was dealing cards. These gentlemen are certified public accountants, and we're here to conduct a comprehensive audit of Stratos Tech's financial practices. Audit? Carson's voice cracked like a 13-year-old kid asking someone to prom. On whose authority? You can't just walk into my office and demand. Actually, we can, I interrupted, picking up one of the documents and holding it where he could see it. See, Carson, here's the thing you never bothered to learn about your own company. I own 95% of it. The silence that followed was absolutely beautiful. Carson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His face went through about 17 different shades of white, and I swear I could actually hear his brain trying to process what I'd just told him. That's impossible, he stammered. I built this company. I own this company. I'm the CEO. You're the CEO because I let you be the CEO, I said, sitting down in one of his expensive leather chairs and making myself comfortable. But that's about to change. Priya had finished spreading out the paperwork, and it looked like a corporate crime scene. Share certificates, transfer documents, voting trusts, merger agreements. 5 years' worth of carefully orchestrated financial maneuvering that had turned Carson's company into my company without him even noticing. This is insane, Carson said, grabbing one of the documents and staring at it like it might suddenly change into something that made sense. These can't be real. Julian doesn't have this kind of money. He's unemployed. He lives in his wife's basement. Actually, I said, standing up and straightening my tie, I'm a retired tech entrepreneur who sold his previous company for more money than you've made in your entire career. But thanks for playing. One of the audit guys, a thin, serious-looking dude who probably dreamed about balance sheets, stepped forward and pointed to a section of the documents. Mr. Vance, these share transfer records clearly show that various investment entities controlled by Mr. Cross have been systematically acquiring Stratos Tech stock over the past 3 years. The transactions are all legitimate and properly documented. Carson sank into his chair like someone had just told him Santa Claus wasn't real and the Easter Bunny was a fraud. But how? Why? I never authorized any of this. That's the beautiful thing about public companies, Carson, I said. You don't get to authorize who buys your stock. People with money buy shares, and eventually, if they're smart and patient enough, they end up owning the whole damn thing. This is a hostile takeover, he sputtered, finally finding his voice again. This is corporate sabotage. I'll sue you. You'll what? Priya interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. Sue the majority shareholder for exercising his legal rights? Good luck with that strategy. Carson's face was cycling through colors like a broken traffic light, red with anger, white with shock, green around the gills with nausea. I was starting to feel a little sorry for the guy. Almost. Then I remembered him calling me a basement trophy while my wife laughed along, and the sympathy evaporated like morning dew. Here's what's going to happen, I said, leaning forward and looking him straight in the eye. Effective immediately, you're fired as CEO of Stratos Tech. Your corporate credit cards are canceled, your company car goes back to the fleet, and that corner office you're so proud of? Someone else's problem now. You can't do this, he shouted, jumping to his feet like his chair was on fire. The board will never approve this. I have contracts. I have rights. The board will approve whatever I tell them to approve, I said calmly. As for your contracts, well, I'm sure Priya would be happy to explain the conduct detrimental to company interests clause you never bothered to read. Priya smiled like a shark who'd just smelled blood in the water. Page 47, subsection C. Insulting and humiliating business partners or their family members at public events definitely qualifies as detrimental conduct. Carson's face went from traffic light colors to straight-up ash gray. Business partners? Julian's not a business partner. He's just the guy who owns your company. I finished. The guy you decided to humiliate at a Christmas party for cheap laughs. The guy whose wife you convinced to laugh along while you turned him into a punchline. For the first time since we'd walked into his office, Carson looked genuinely scared. Not angry or confused, but actually frightened. It was finally sinking in that this wasn't some elaborate prank or misunderstanding. This was real, and his perfect little kingdom was crumbling around him. "Julian," he said, his voice suddenly small and pleading. "Look, maybe I was out of line last night. Maybe I said some things I shouldn't have. We can work this out, right? We can come to some kind of arrangement." I stood up and walked around his desk, stopping directly in front of him. He was sweating openly now, his perfect hair starting to wilt, his expensive suit looking rumpled and desperate. "Carson," I said quietly, "you called me a broke, clingy, forgettable basement trophy in front of a room full of people. You made my wife laugh at me. You turned my marriage into your entertainment for the evening." He opened his mouth to say something, probably another apology or excuse, but I held up my hand to stop him. "So no, we can't work this out. And no, we can't come to an arrangement. You're done." I turned to Priya, who was already closing up the folder and preparing to deliver the final blow. "Oh, and Carson," I said, pausing at the door, "I'm naming Layla Chun as interim CEO. You know, the woman whose ideas you've been stealing for years? The one you never thought was smart enough to run things." His face went completely white. "Layla? But she's just a programmer. She's a programmer who actually understands technology, treats people with respect, and has never once called anyone a basement trophy," I said. Funny how that works out. As we walked out of his office, I could hear him behind us, frantically dialing numbers on his phone, probably trying to call board members or lawyers or anyone who might be able to save his ass. Good luck with that, I thought. After all, it's hard to fight a ghost when you finally realize he's been holding all the cards the entire time. If I thought the drive home after the Christmas party was therapeutic, the drive home after firing Carson was like winning the lottery, curing cancer, and discovering the meaning of life all rolled into one beautiful, satisfying package. I took the scenic route again, windows down despite the December chill, letting the cold air wash over me while I processed what had just happened. Carson Vance. The man who'd called me a basement trophy, who'd humiliated me in front of dozens of people, who'd convinced my own wife to laugh at me, was probably sitting in his now former office right about now, staring at the papers that proved he'd never really owned anything. The mental image of his face when reality finally sank in was going to keep me warm for years. My phone had been buzzing nonstop since I'd left Stratos Tech. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails. The corporate gossip mill was working overtime, and apparently everyone wanted to talk to the mysterious new owner who'd just dropped a nuclear bomb on their workplace. I ignored all of it. There'd be time for damage control and PR later. Right now, I just wanted to enjoy the silence before the storm hit my house. Because oh boy, was there going to be a storm. I pulled into our driveway around 6 p.m., and I could see Sienna's car already there. The lights were on in the living room, kitchen, and what looked like every other room in the house. Either she was throwing a party, or she was pacing around like a caged tiger, working herself into the kind of fury that could peel paint off walls. Given that her boss had just been fired by her supposedly unemployed husband, I was betting on option 2. The front door wasn't locked, probably because Sienna was too wound up to remember basic security, so I walked into my own house like I was entering a war zone. The silence was different from last night. Last night had been shocked, confused silence. Tonight was the kind of silence that comes right before someone starts throwing expensive dishes at your head. "Julian." Her voice came from the living room, and it had that fake calm quality that every married man learns to recognize as the vocal equivalent of a tornado siren. "Yeah, it's me," I called back, hanging up my coat and loosening my tie. No point in pretending this was going to be a pleasant conversation. I found her in the living room, still wearing the same clothes she'd worn to work that morning, but her perfect hair was messed up like she'd been running her hands through it, and her makeup was slightly smudged around the eyes. She was standing by the window, staring out at the street like she expected a parade of angry board members to come marching up our driveway. Sit down, she said without turning around. I think I'll stand, I replied, crossing my arms and leaning against the doorframe. If this was going to be a fight, I wanted to be ready to move. She spun around, and I could see the full extent of her fury written across her face. Her eyes were bright with anger, her cheeks were flushed, and she was gripping her phone so tightly I was surprised the screen hadn't cracked. What the hell did you do? She demanded, her voice climbing toward that pitch that makes dogs whimper and neighbors call the cops. I had a meeting, I said calmly. A very productive meeting. A meeting? She took a step toward me, and I could see her hands shaking with rage. Julian, you got Carson fired. You somehow took over his company. My phone has been ringing nonstop for 6 hours with people asking me what the hell is going on. And what did you tell them? I told them I had no idea, she screamed, throwing her phone onto the couch hard enough that it bounced twice. Because I don't. I don't know anything about you. I don't know where you got the money. I don't know how you bought a company. I don't know why you did it. And I sure as hell don't know why you decided to destroy my career in the process. There it was. The real issue. Not that I'd been humiliated and she'd laughed along. Not that her boss had called me a pathetic loser and she'd found it hilarious. Her career. Her image. Her standing in the corporate world. Your career, I repeated slowly. That's what you're worried about. Your career. Of course that's what I'm worried about. She started pacing back and forth like she was trying to wear a hole in the hardwood floor. Do you have any idea how this looks? My husband, who everyone thinks is unemployed, just fired my boss and took over the company. People are going to think I was in on it. They're going to think I've been lying to them for years. You have been lying to them for years, I said quietly. She stopped pacing and stared at me. What's that supposed to mean? It means you've been telling everyone that your husband is a loser who lives off your success, when the truth is that your success comes from the company I own. Her mouth fell open. That's not. I never said you were a loser. Really, I pushed off from the doorframe and took a step toward her. Because last night, when Carson called me a broke, clingy, forgettable basement trophy, you didn't exactly rush to defend me. That was different. No, Sienna, that was honest. For the first time in our marriage, you were completely honest about how you see me. She shook her head violently, like she could physically reject what I was saying. You're being ridiculous. I was caught off guard. It was awkward. I didn't know what to say. You knew exactly what to say. I replied, my voice getting harder. You said nothing, and then you laughed. It was just a joke. A joke. I felt my own anger starting to rise, the calm control I'd maintained all day finally beginning to crack. Sienna, he called me a nobody in front of a room full of people. He said I was pathetic and forgettable. He made me the entertainment for the evening, and you thought it was funny. I was trying to keep the peace. Bullshit. The word came out sharper than I'd intended, and she flinched like I'd slapped her. You were trying to keep your position. You were trying to make sure your boss still liked you, even if it meant throwing your husband under the bus. Tears started forming in her eyes, but I wasn't in the mood to be moved by them. Julian, please. You're scaring me. This isn't like you. You don't do things like this. You don't fight back. And there it was. The truth she didn't even realize she'd spoken. You're right, I said, sitting down on the couch and looking at her with something that might have been sadness. The Julian you married doesn't fight back. He sits quietly in corners, lets people insult him, and pretends it doesn't hurt when his own wife laughs along. I picked up her phone from where she'd thrown it and held it out to her. But that Julian died last night, Sienna, right around the time you decided that keeping your boss happy was more important than defending your husband. She took the phone with shaking hands. So what happens now? You've embarrassed me in front of everyone I work with. You've made me look like a fool or a liar or both. What's your next move in this little revenge fantasy? I stood up and walked toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom step. This isn't revenge, Sienna. This is me finally being honest about who I am and what I'm capable of. And what about us? Her voice was small now, almost childlike. What about our marriage? I looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her. The woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I'd thought I'd spend my life with, the woman who'd laughed when someone called me a basement trophy. I don't know, I said honestly. I guess that depends on whether you can learn to respect the man you actually married, instead of the man you thought you could manage. I started up the stairs, but her voice stopped me. Julian, wait. Please. I'm sorry. I should have defended you. I know that. But this isn't the way to handle it. You're hurting innocent people. You're destroying. I'm not destroying anything, I said without turning around. I'm building something better, with people who actually deserve it. People like Layla, who's been doing Carson's job for years without getting any credit. And what about me? She whispered. I turned around and looked down at her from the top of the stairs. She looked so small standing there in our living room, surrounded by all the expensive things we'd bought together, holding her phone like it was the last connection to the life she'd thought she understood. That's up to you, I said. You can learn who you actually married, or you can keep pretending I'm the man you thought you could keep in the basement. But either way, I'm done being your trophy. I went into our bedroom, closed the door, and for the first time in years, I locked it. Outside, I could hear her crying. But for the first time since last night, I wasn't the one who felt like breaking. 3 weeks later, Stratos Tech looked like a completely different company. Hell, it practically was a completely different company. Walking through the halls that used to echo with the sound of stressed-out employees kissing Carson's ass, I now heard something I'd never experienced there before: actual laughter. People talking about ideas instead of politics. The sound of productivity instead of panic. Layla Chun had turned out to be everything I'd hoped for, and then some. Where Carson had ruled through fear and micromanagement, Layla led through competence and respect. She didn't need to scream at people to get results. She just had to show them that their work actually mattered, and suddenly everyone was busting their asses to prove they belonged there. "Morning, Mr. Cross," she said as I walked into what used to be Carson's corner office. She'd completely redecorated the place, trading his pretentious awards and ego wall for whiteboards covered in project timelines and actual engineering diagrams. The massive desk had been replaced with a standing workstation surrounded by comfortable chairs where people could actually collaborate instead of being lectured. "Just Julian," I said for probably the 100th time since she'd taken over. "And good morning to you too, CEO Chen." She grinned at that. Layla had this infectious smile that made everyone around her want to work harder, be better, actually give a damn about what they were doing. It was the complete opposite of Carson's fake corporate charm. "The Q4 numbers came in," she said, sliding a tablet across her desk. "Revenue's up 18% from last quarter, employee satisfaction scores are through the roof, and we just landed 3 new contracts that Carson had been fumbling for months." I scrolled through the data, shaking my head in amazement. How the hell did Carson keep this company from growing? It's like he was actively trying to sabotage his own success. When you spend all your time playing politics instead of focusing on the product, this is what happens, Layla said, pulling up another screen showing employee retention rates. Half the talent he drove away is already asking about coming back. "Bring them back," I said without hesitation. "Anyone who left because of Carson's management style gets a clean slate and a fair interview." Already on it. She made a note on her tablet. "Speaking of clean slates, marketing wants to know what to do about Sienna." And there it was. The elephant in the room that everyone was too polite to mention directly. Sienna had taken a leave of absence the day after our fight, claiming she needed time to reassess her professional priorities. In corporate speak, that meant she was hiding in our house, alternating between crying, rage cleaning, and sending me text messages that I mostly ignored. "What about her?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "She's good at her job," Layla said carefully. "The team likes her, her campaigns are effective, and honestly, she never treated people the way Carson did. But everyone knows she's your wife, and they're all walking on eggshells wondering if she's going to get special treatment or if she's going to be collateral damage in whatever's happening between you two." I sank into one of the comfortable chairs Layla had installed, suddenly feeling every one of the sleepless nights I'd been having since the Christmas party. "What do you think I should do?" "I think," Layla said, sitting across from me, "that you should treat her the same way you treat any other employee. If she's good at her job, she stays. If she wants to come back, she comes back. What happens in your marriage is your business, but what happens in this company is everyone's business." Smart woman. This was exactly why I'd put her in charge. "Fair enough," I said. "Tell marketing that when Sienna's ready to come back, she'll be evaluated on her work, not her last name. Same standards as everyone else." "Will do." Layla made another note, then looked up at me with that expression that meant she was about to say something I probably didn't want to hear. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot. Are you okay? And don't give me some corporate bullshit answer. You look like you haven't slept in weeks." I had to laugh at that. Here I was, finally living openly as a successful businessman instead of hiding in my basement like some kind of corporate vampire, and I probably looked worse than when everyone thought I was unemployed. Honestly, I don't know, I said. I spent 5 years being invisible, letting everyone think I was a failure, watching my own wife be embarrassed by me. Now I'm finally being myself, but I don't know if there's anything left to save in my marriage. You know what the difference is between you and Carson? Layla asked. Besides the fact that I'm not a complete asshole? She laughed. Carson destroyed things because he was insecure and needed to prove he was important. You're building things because you actually care about making them better. She gestured toward the window, where we could see employees collaborating in the break room, actually smiling while they worked. Look at this place. Look at what it's become in 3 weeks. You didn't fire Carson because you wanted revenge, though I'm sure that felt good. You fired him because he was hurting people. Your point. My point is that the same guy who saw potential in this company and saved it might want to think about whether there's potential in his marriage worth saving too. Before I could respond, her phone buzzed with what looked like an urgent message. The Cross Foundation launch event, she said, reading the screen. Your assistant wants to confirm the final headcount for tomorrow night. Right. The Cross Foundation. My attempt to do something meaningful with all the money I'd made over the years. Mentorship programs, scholarships, coding boot camps for kids who couldn't afford college. All the things I wished had existed when I was starting out. Tell them we're expecting 200, I said, standing up to leave. And Layla? Thanks for the advice. Anytime, boss. As I walked out of Stratos Tech that afternoon, I realized something had changed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was building something instead of just tearing things down. The question was, what else was worth rebuilding? I almost didn't see her at first. The Cross Foundation launch event was in full swing. 200 people packed into the community center, mentors connecting with kids, scholarship recipients meeting their sponsors, the kind of organized chaos that happens when you put passionate people in a room together and let them change the world. Then I spotted her in the corner, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual power suit, helping a teenage girl figure out how to set up her laptop for a coding workshop. Sienna. She'd been showing up to foundation events for the past 2 weeks, never making a big deal about it, never asking for recognition or trying to talk to me. She just helped. Quietly. The way she used to volunteer at the animal shelter when we first started dating, before corporate ambition turned her into someone who measured everything by quarterly reports and networking opportunities. I watched her explain something to the girl, probably basic Python syntax, knowing Sienna's background in digital marketing, and saw the kid's face light up when the code finally worked. That smile, that moment of pure joy when someone discovers they can create something from nothing, was exactly why I'd started the foundation in the first place. She's been here every day this week, said Marcus, my foundation director, appearing beside me with 2 cups of coffee. Doesn't make a fuss, doesn't try to take charge, just shows up and works. I noticed, I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. She cried yesterday, he continued, his voice gentle. During the mentorship session with the middle schoolers from downtown. One of the kids was talking about how his dad left when he found out about the scholarship, said he didn't want a charity case for his son. Sienna just broke down. I felt something twist in my chest. Not forgiveness, exactly. More like recognition. The woman helping that teenager wasn't the same woman who'd laughed at Carson's joke. This was someone I hadn't seen in years, the real Sienna, the one who'd gotten buried under designer clothes and corporate expectations. She asked me not to tell you she was here, Marcus added. But you're telling me anyway. He shrugged. Because I think you both forgot something important. You're not the only one who's been pretending to be someone else. As if she could feel me watching, Sienna looked up. Our eyes met across the room. And for a moment, neither of us moved. Then she turned back to the girl, but I'd seen something in her face. Vulnerability, maybe. Or hope. I didn't go over to talk to her. We weren't ready for that yet. But I didn't look away either. Trust takes time to rebuild. Respect grows slowly. And forgiveness? That's the hardest part of all. But watching my wife help a stranger's kid discover her own potential, seeing her tears for a boy whose father couldn't see past his pride to love his son, that was a start. Maybe not a big start, but sometimes the smallest steps forward are the ones that matter most. 3 months. 3 months since Carson had called me a basement trophy and my world had turned upside down. Now here I was, walking into the exact same ballroom where it all started, except this time everything was different. The decorations were still over-the-top expensive, the champagne was still flowing like water, and the same crowd of corporate types was still trying to out-impress each other. But tonight wasn't Carson's show. Tonight was Stratos Tech's New Year celebration, and the guest of honor wasn't the man who'd been fired. It was the woman who'd replaced him. Ladies and gentlemen, Layla's voice carried clearly through the ballroom as she stood at the podium. I want to introduce someone who's been in the shadows too long. The man who saved this company when we didn't even know we needed saving. The man who believed in us when our former leadership didn't. The man who gave us all a second chance. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me as I made my way to the front. No more hiding in corners, no more being invisible. These people knew who I was now, knew what I'd done, knew that the quiet guy they'd ignored was the reason they all still had jobs. The applause wasn't polite corporate clapping. It was genuine, grateful, real. The kind of applause you get from people who actually respect you instead of just tolerating your presence. But my eyes weren't on the crowd. They were on Sienna, sitting quietly in the second row, wearing a simple black dress instead of her usual power suit. She wasn't trying to network or climb social ladders tonight. She was just there. When our eyes met, she started crying. Not the angry tears from our fight months ago, but something softer, something that looked like understanding. She clapped along with everyone else, but her tears told the real story. She finally saw me. Not the man she'd thought she could manage or fix or be embarrassed by. The man I actually was. It had taken losing everything for us both to find out who we really were underneath all the pretending. The question now was whether that was enough to build something real. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my office, the real one upstairs, not the basement hideout, watching Sienna through the window as she teaches coding to a group of kids in our backyard. She's laughing at something one of them said, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing old jeans with grass stains on the knees. This is who she was before the corporate world convinced her she had to be someone else. This is who I fell in love with. We're not fixed. Hell, we're barely even okay most days. Marriage counseling twice a week, separate bedrooms, conversations that still end in tears more often than laughter. But we're trying. Actually trying. Instead of just pretending everything's fine while we slowly poison each other with resentment. Stratos Tech is thriving under Layla's leadership. Revenue's up 40%, employee satisfaction is through the roof, and we just opened offices in 3 new cities. The Cross Foundation has placed over 200 kids in mentorship programs and funded 50 full scholarships. Carson, last I heard, he was selling insurance in Phoenix and telling anyone who'd listen about the time he almost built a tech empire. The funny thing is, none of that matters as much as I thought it would. Don't get me wrong. I love seeing the company succeed, love watching kids discover they can code their way to better futures, love knowing that Carson's learning what it feels like to be nobody special. But what I really love is living honestly. No more hiding who I am. No more pretending to be less than I am just to make other people comfortable. No more being anyone's basement trophy. I used to think the worst thing in the world was being invisible. Turns out the worst thing was being visible but completely misunderstood, even by the person who was supposed to know me best. Sienna looks up from the laptop she's sharing with a 10-year-old girl and catches me watching. She waves, smiles that real smile that made me marry her in the first place. I wave back. We're rebuilding. Slowly, carefully, honestly. Because I don't want to be loved for what I own. I want to be respected for who I am. They called me a trophy in the basement. Now I'm the architect of the house they all live in.